Hello there, Michelle Short here for My Favourite Things. Today I'm creating a galaxy background using the new Headed for the Stars set. So let's get started. This is the adorable Headed for the Stars set. I absolutely love all of the different characters in the set, but for today I thought I would use the Rhino. I thought I would have him hanging from the balloon kind of in a galaxy background. So I've started off by stamping him down onto some smooth white cardstock using black ink. I can now add colour using Copic markers. So I'm starting off with my darkest shade, and this is T8. I don't often use the toner greys, I sometimes forget about them, but they are really nice if you want to add a little bit of warmth to the grey. They're not as warm as the warm greys, but they're also not as cool as the cool or the neutral grey, so they're really quite nice, especially for animals. So I'm mapping out where I think my darkest area will be. Because I've got him in this galaxy background, there is quite a lot of colour going to be behind him. So I wanted the darker areas to be towards the bottom of him, and then also around the edges. Because he's rounded, you would get some shadows around the outside edges as well as the bottom. So I blended the T8 out with the T6. I'm now going in with the T5. So I'm pushing that colour more into the image and then also blending with the darker shades. So hopefully I get a really nice smooth transition. Ordinarily, when I'm colouring with Copic markers, I do tend to miss out a shade. This is really good, especially with greys, because you definitely don't need all of the markers at all. I usually would kind of maybe use the 6, the 4 and the 2, and they would blend all really nicely together and I would get a really nice smooth blend. But because I do have all of the shades for today, I decided to just use them all. So I went with T8, T6, 5, 4, 3, 2, and then I'm going to finish off with the 1. So I can just finish off with that one there at the top, but I didn't feel like I got a smooth blend in the middle. So I'm going back in with the T4, just adding a little bit of extra darkness towards that middle section. And then I can go in with the T2 and just blend the top of that little bit of the T4 that I added, just to make sure that I get a nice smooth blend. Then I did realise that when I was stamping the image, I must have had a little kind of bit of fuzziness from the ink pad. And so I did get an extra few bits just around the outside edges of the image, especially on the bottom of his legs. So I'm just using a craft knife there just to remove that excess ink from the surface of the cardstock. Once I do the die cutting, you'll never see that. It won't be a problem. For his horn, I used some warm grey tones, so I used W5, W3 and then W0, but I felt like the transition wasn't quite smooth enough, so I am going to go back in with that W1 just to try and blend the colours together a little bit better. For his ears, I'm using the T3 and the T1, and then the ear on the right hand side is drawn so that you can kind of see the inside of his ear. And whilst I don't think the inside of a Rhino's ear is a bright pink, I thought it would look quite cute. So I used RV55 and then I'm blending that out with the RV52. For the balloon, I'm using some yellow tones. I'm starting off with the Y17 and I'm going around the outside edges of the balloon here with that darker shade. I am adding more darkness towards the right hand side and then having the highlight of the balloon be in the top left hand corner. I blended that out with the Y15 and then realised at this point I wanted a little bit of extra darkness on the balloon. So I'm going in with YR27 and this is quite a lot darker than the Y17, but once I blend the two together it's going to blend really nicely. So I'm just going around the outside edge, adding just a very small amount on that top left hand corner, but I do want to make sure that I do add that darkness around the whole of the outside edge. Like I said, with rounded objects it's definitely darker around the outside edges. And then blending that out with the Y17 again, followed by the Y15, the Y13, and then I can finish off with that light highlight there with the Y00. I can then take the coordinating headed for the stars dynamics, place the die over the image and hold it down with some low tack tape. I then also wanted to die cut some of the clouds. I didn't want the stamped lines of the clouds, I just wanted the die cut shapes themselves. So I'm going to cut those from the same white cardstock. So just holding them down with some low tack tape, and then I can run those through my die cutting machine. And I did decide to cut the larger of the cloud twice. So now I've got my elements for my card, but I want to stamp a sentiment. So I'm taking the sentiment from the set that says wishing you a sky full of stars. I thought that that would make the most sense with my galaxy background that I'm going to do. So I have placed that in the mini MISTI. I'm going to stamp it down onto some black licorice cardstock. So I'm prepping the cardstock with an anti-static powder tool, and then I can remove the excess powder with a brush. I can then ink up the stamp using Versamark ink. This is a clear sticky ink so that when I add the embossing powder on top, it's going to stick to it. So just inking up that stamp really well, and then I can stamp that down onto the cardstock, making sure not to press too hard because this is quite a small sentiment. I can then apply some detail white embossing powder. I do like to apply it a few times and tap off the excess. I'm then going to bring in a clean dry brush and just remove any excess particles of embossing powder that are in the wrong place. I can then heat set the sentiment until it's completely melted. Once it's dry, I can remove any of that excess anti-static powder with a cloth and then cut that down into a strip. For the galaxy background, I've taken a panel of white cardstock cut to 4¼ inches by 5½ inches. I've placed it on a sticky mat while I do my ink blending on top with distress inks. So I started off by adding some mustard seed, and now I'm going in with picked raspberry, followed by mermaid lagoon. I did want my background to be quite bright and vibrant because with the galaxy background obviously there is quite a lot of black, and also my image is quite neutral, like the Rhino obviously is grey, so I did want there to be quite a lot of colour in the background. But in hindsight I think I should have made these blobs of colour a little bit smaller. I should have broken them up a little bit better with the black ink, but I do like how vibrant they are in the end. So I used wilted violet there and then also twisted citron. And now I'm going in with chipped sapphire, and I'm just using this shade kind of like a transition colour. You're not going to end up seeing it, but I do quite like to sometimes add this darker blue in around the colours so that when I add the black ink on top, it's kind of blends a little bit easier. I did want the focal point of the card to be towards the top of the panel, and so I thought it would look quite nice to kind of fade out the galaxy background. So I'm kind of, as I go down the panel, sort of fading it out towards the colour of the cardstock. I can now go in with black soot distress ink, and I'm going around the outside edges and then in between all of these colourful blobs. Like I say, I think I should have broken them up a little bit more than they are, but never mind. So it's going to look awful at this point. Well, it's looked awful already to start with, and even like once I add all of the ink blending, it does look really messy. But once you add kind of like the white stars on top, I do think it looks a lot nicer. So I'm just making sure that I get a lot of dark areas here with that black soot, and then like I say, I'm going to try and fade it out a little bit towards the bottom. And then the secret for me with galaxy backgrounds is to go back in with those colours. So I'm going back in with the same colours that I used and just adding another layer on top. You wouldn't think that you can blend a colour over the top of black, but this does blend really nicely together, and it kind of just fills in those little gaps where the black ink kind of fades off as well. So that's quite nice. I think it does blend really nicely together. So just finishing off here with that wilted violet. And it just makes them a lot more vibrant in colour as well. So I'm now just going black in with that black soot, just going over the areas and again trying to fade that down a little bit towards the bottom. I do want to add some white paint over the top to bring in the stars. So I'm taking some bleed proof white paint and I'm adding a little bit of that onto a craft sheet, mixing that with a little bit of water just to loosen it a little bit so that it's easier for me to splatter onto my background. So I'm trying to make sure that I don't have too much on the brush here because I don't want too many big blobs of this paint. And then I can tap the paintbrush to splatter on that paint onto the background. And like I said, this is going to create the stars in my galaxy. So I'm adding quite a lot of this paint just to add a lot of stars and give quite a lot of interest to that background. I did set that aside to dry for a little while. I've now taken an A2 size white card base, so that's a finished size of 4¼ inches by 5½ inches. I've added some tape runner adhesive onto the front of that, and then I can place the panel on top, just trying to line them up as best as possible. Once I'm happy, I'm then going to take a scrap piece of paper and just press that down. Although my panel is dry, I just wanted to make sure that I didn't get any fingerprints in that ink. I can now bring in all of the elements here, place them down so that I can see where I want them to be before I stick anything down. And whilst you probably wouldn't get bright white clouds in a galaxy background, I do think they definitely add to the design. So I'm pretty happy, I think, with this placement. I'm just going to move these clouds up a little bit. And then I can add some tape runner adhesive onto the back of the clouds. I am going to have the two larger ones overhanging the side of the card base. I do like to do that with elements, especially when I've just got the focal point sort of in one part of the card. So in this instance, sort of in the top part of the card, because I feel like it makes it look like there's a bigger scene outside the edge of the card base. So I can add a bit more adhesive onto the back of this cloud here on the left hand side and then place that down. I'm then going to take some scissors and cut off the excess, and I find it easier to do from the back of the card. I can then add some foam tape onto the back of the Rhino and then also the sentiment. I can remove the backings off of that foam tape with some tweezers, and then I'm also going to grab some more tweezers so that I can hover the image in place so that I can see where I want it to be placed before I stick that down. Once I'm happy with the placement, I can press him down. And then I can just do the same thing for the sentiment. So I'm going to bring in my T-square ruler here so that I can try and line up the sentiment so it's straight. So again, hovering it in place to start with, and then once I'm happy, I can press that down. I'm then adding some black glaze pen to the Rhino's eye just to help it pop a little bit. And then I'm adding some crystal glaze onto the balloon. So just going around the outside edges to start with, and then I can fill in the inside. And then I'm going to take a pokey tool just to make sure that I move that kind of crystal glaze all the way to the edges of the balloon. And then once that dries, it's going to dry completely clear. So like I say, I'm really happy with how the card turned out. I do think I could have made those blobs of colour a little bit smaller in the background, but it does give a nice colourful vibrancy to the card. Links to the products that I used will be listed here in the description bar on YouTube. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful day.